Buddhism. The oldest known date in the history of India is the death of the one called Buddha in 483 BC, and even that date is somewhat controversial. Buddha means one who is intuitive, awakened, or enlightened. The famous historical person known as Buddha was also called the Tathagata, which means the one who has come thus, and Shakyamuni, which means the sage of the Shakya tribe. He is said to have lived 80 years and thus was probably born in 563 BC. Siddhartha Gautama, his father, Suddhodana, of the Gautama clan, was elected king of the Shakya tribe by its 500 families just south of the Himalaya Mountains in the realm of influence of the powerful Kosala monarchy. The son was born in the Lumbini garden and named Siddhartha, which means he who has accomplished his aim. Many myths and legends surround the birth of Siddhartha, but most of these seem to have developed centuries later in the Jataka. A famous seer named Asita predicted that the child would either become a great king or, if he left home, a great teacher. His mother, Maya, died 7 days after giving birth, and her younger sister, Mahapajapati, who was also married to Suddhodana, became his foster mother. By all accounts, Siddhartha was raised amid the finest luxuries of the time. Later, he said that 3 palaces had been built for him, one for hot weather, one for cold, and one for the rainy season. His clothes were of the finest silk. When he walked on the ground, someone held a white umbrella over his head. Even the servants were well fed, and music was played only by beautiful women. Having demonstrated his skill in archery, Siddhartha chose for his wife Yasodhara and was married when he was about 16 years old. For the next 13 years, he continued to live in luxury with his wife and concubines. Then, about the time of the birth of his son Rahula, the famous 4 signs occurred. According to legend, his father had tried to prevent his princely son from experiencing any suffering or sorrow or religious contact, so that he would become a king rather than a spiritual teacher. However, one day while traveling outside the palace gates, Siddhartha happened to come across an old man for the first time in his life. He was appalled at the wrinkles and decrepitude. On another occasion, he happened to observe a sick person and learned about the loathsome nature of disease. The third sign came when he witnessed the funeral procession and was able to see the lifeless corpse that was being carried. The suddenness of these 3 experiences set him thinking about the transitoriness of human life. Finally, he came upon a religious ascetic who had renounced the world to seek enlightenment, a common occupation for kshatriyas like himself, as well as for Brahmins, as we saw in the contemporary life of Mahavira. With the birth of his son, he had fulfilled his obligation to continue his family line and decided that he too must renounce his kingdom and seek a way out of the human miseries of old age, sickness, and death. So he took off his silk garments and put on the coarse clothes of an ascetic and went south to Magadha seeking enlightenment. While begging for his food in Rajagriha, the capital city of Magadha, his princely demeanor was observed by King Bimbisara, also known as Shrenika. The king went to see Siddhartha to find out who he was and what he was doing. Siddhartha told him that he was purifying himself in order to achieve nirvana, and he promised to teach the king after he attained enlightenment. Like the sages of the Upanishads, Siddhartha practiced yoga and meditation. At Vaishali, to learn meditative concentration, he studied with Alara Kalama, who was said to have had hundreds of disciples. Siddhartha soon learned how to reach the formless world, but still having mental anxieties, he decided not to become a disciple of Alara Kalama. Nor did he become a disciple of his second teacher, Udaka Ramaputra, after he attained the high state of consciousness beyond thought and non-thought. Still, not satisfied, Siddhartha decided to practice the path of extreme austerities. And in his quest, he was joined by the sage Kandinya and 4 others. He pressed his tongue against his palate to try to restrain his mind until the perspiration poured from his armpits. He restrained his breath and heard the violent sounds of wind in his ears and head. He went into trances, and some thought he was dead. He fasted for long periods of time and then decided to try limiting his food to the juice of beans and peas. As his flesh shrank, the bones almost stuck out of his skin so that he could touch his spine from the front. And after sitting on the ground, his imprint looked like a camel's footprint. For 6 years, Siddhartha practiced such austerities. But instead of achieving superhuman knowledge and wisdom, he only seemed to get weaker and weaker. Finally, he thought that maybe there was a better way to attain enlightenment. He remembered how while his father was working, he used to sit in the shade of an apple tree, free of sensual desires. Perhaps in concentrating his mind without evil ideas and sensual desires, he should not be afraid of a happy state of mind. However, to gain the strength he felt he needed for this concentration, he decided to start eating again. When he gave up practicing the extreme austerities, the 5 mendicants who were with him became disillusioned and left him, saying that Gautama lives in abundance and he has given up striving. Siddhartha reasoned that a life of penance and pain was no better than a life of luxury and pleasure, because if penance on earth is religion, then the heavenly reward for penance must be irreligion. If merit comes from purity of food, then deer should have the most merit. Those who practice asceticism without calming their passions are like a man trying to kindle fire by rubbing a stick on green wood in water. But those who have no desires or worldly attachments are like a man using a dry stick that ignites. Regaining his strength from normal eating of the food he begged, Siddhartha once again practiced meditation. Now he easily attained the first stage of joy and pleasure. Then a joyful trance arising from concentration with serenity and the mind fixed on one point without reasoning and investigation. The third stage produced equanimity to joy and aversion in a mindful, happy state. In the fourth stage, pleasure and pain were left behind in a mindful purity. With his mind thus concentrated and cleansed, he directed it to the remembrance of former existences from previous births, also perceiving cycles of evolution and dissolution of the universe. Then he directed his mind to the passing away and rebirth of beings, perceiving how the karma of evil actions, words, and thoughts leads to rebirth in miserable conditions and suffering in hell. But those beings leading good lives are reborn in a happy state in a heavenly world. Finally, directing his mind to the means of ultimate release, Siddhartha realized that there is pain, a cause of pain, the cessation of pain, and a way that leads to the cessation of pain. Thus his mind was emancipated from sensual desires, the desire for existence, and ignorance. According to legend, this whole process occurred in one night, after he had decided to sit under a tree until he became enlightened or died. It was also said that he was tested by Mara, the tempter. But Siddhartha could not be swayed from his purpose. Thus darkness and ignorance were dispelled by the light as Siddhartha Gautama became enlightened and was henceforth known as the Buddha. Buddha. Having gained this doctrine, the Buddha thought how difficult it would be for humanity to understand because of their attachments and lust. Trying to teach it to them would be vexation for him. However, the god Brahma asked him to teach the doctrine because some people who were not too impure were falling away from not hearing the teachings. Then the Buddha, in pity for beings, surveyed their conditions and saw some of little impurity whom he could teach. At first, he thought of his former teachers, Alara Kalama and Udaka, but in his clairvoyant awareness, he realized that both of them had just died in the last few days. Then he decided to teach the 5 mendicants who had been with him in their striving. Perceiving that they were in the deer park at Benares, he decided to go there. Along the way, he met an Ajivika ascetic named Upaka, who, when told of the Buddha's enlightenment, merely said that he hoped that it was so and went his way. When the 5 mendicants saw Siddhartha Gautama, they thought they would not rise in respect, but would offer him a seat. However, as the Buddha arrived, they spontaneously greeted him as a friend. They still criticized him for living in abundance, but the Buddha explained that he does not live in abundance. He spoke to them as one enlightened, and they had to agree that he had never spoken to them in that manner before. While he admonished 2 of them, the other 3 went off to collect alms. Then he spoke with those 3 while the other 2 went for alms. In this way, all 5 soon attained insight and the supreme peace. In this deer park at Benares, the Buddha gave his first sermon, in which he explained that the 2 extremes are not to be practiced by the one who is enlightened. What is joined with the passions and luxury, which is low, vulgar, common, ignoble, and useless, nor what is joined with self-torture, which is painful, ignoble, and useless too. Avoiding these 2 extremes, the enlightened follow the middle path, which produces insight and knowledge and leads to peace, wisdom, enlightenment, and nirvana. Buddha then expounded the 4 noble, which is Aryan, is the word for noble, truths of his doctrine. This is a quote. Now this, monks, is the noble truth of pain. Birth is painful. Old age is painful. Sickness is painful. Death is painful. Sorrow, lamentation, dejection, and despair are painful. Contact with unpleasant things is painful. Not getting what one wishes is painful. In short, the 5 groups of grasping are painful. Now this, monks, is the noble truth of the cause of pain. The craving which leads to rebirth, combined with pleasure and lust, finding pleasure here and there, namely the craving for passion, the craving for existence, and the craving for non-existence. Now this, monks, is the noble truth of the cessation of pain. The cessation without a remainder of craving, the abandonment, forsaking, release, and non-attachment. Now this, monks, is the noble truth of the way that leads to the cessation of pain. This is the noble eightfold way, namely correct understanding, correct intention, correct speech, correct action, correct livelihood, correct attention, correct concentration, and correct meditation. The Buddha declared that Kandinya had understood the doctrine, and he welcomed him as the first monk in the community by saying, "Come, monk, well proclaimed is the doctrine. Lead a religious life for making a complete end of pain." After further instruction, the other 4 mendicants were also admitted into the community, Sangha. Then the Buddha preached to the 5 that the body, perceptions, feelings, and mind, and even discriminating consciousness are not the self or soul. By turning away from the body, perceptions, feelings, mind, and discriminating consciousness, one becomes free from craving and emancipated. Life then becomes religious and is no longer under finite conditions. Yasa, the son of a wealthy guildmaster, lived in luxury at Benares, and like Siddhartha, he became disgusted with his palace attendants. After hearing the Buddha's doctrine, he left home and became the first lay disciple in the new community. The first women to become lay disciples were Yasa's mother and former wife. They were soon followed by 4 friends of Yasa, and then 50 more. The Buddha then suggested that the 60 disciples wander around separately to preach the doctrine, so that others may be liberated from the fetters of illusion, while he went to Uruvela in Magadha. There, 30 men of royal blood had entered the forest with their 29 wives and a courtesan for the one who was not married. When the courtesan ran off with the gold, silver, and gems, they all went to search for her and found the Buddha, He asked them if it was more important to seek for that woman or for themselves. When they agreed that their selves were more important, they sat down so that the Buddha could teach them how to seek within themselves. Shakyamuni was sitting under a banyan tree when a Brahmin named Drona approached him in awe, asking if he was a god. The Tathagata said, no. The Brahmin asked if he were a kind of nature spirit, a Gandharva or a Yaksha. But again, the Buddha denied it. When he asked if he were a human, he denied that too. Finally, Drona asked him if he was neither divine, nor non-human, nor human, then what was he? The reply was that he is Buddha, which means awake. Shubha, a Brahmin student, asked the Buddha why humans differed so much in birth, intelligence, health, and so on. Shakyamuni explained that beings are heirs of karma, the consequences of their actions. Evildoers may experience happiness until their deeds ripen, and the good may experience bad things until their good deeds ripen. The pure and the impure create their own destinies. No one can purify another. Also living in this region are 3 Brahmin brothers of the Kashyapa family. They were ascetics with matted hair over the age of 70 and were the most respected religious leaders in Magadha, with a total of about 1,000 disciples. The Buddha spoke with the oldest, Uruvilva Kashyapa, but it was difficult for him to accept that such a young man could be so holy. Finally, the Buddha used his mystic powers, and convinced of the Buddha's superiority, Uruvilva decided to follow him. The Buddha suggested that they ask his 500 followers what they wanted to do, and they all decided to join as well, shaving their hair and beards and throwing their ceremonial utensils into the river. The 2 Kashyapa brothers saw the implements in the river and eventually joined as well with their disciples. On the way to Rajagriha, the Buddha and the 1,000 disciples saw the volcanic mountain Gayashirsa with its glowing fire. The Buddha preached his sermon on fire, how the sensations, perceptions, thoughts, and actions are burning with the poisons of covetousness, anger, and ignorance. At the capital, he preached to King Bimbisara about the triple doctrine of almsgiving, precepts, and good works. The king declared that all 5 of his wishes had been fulfilled, that he might be king, that a Buddha would come to his kingdom, that he would meet him, be instructed by him, and understand the teachings. After the sermon, King Bimbisara donated a bamboo grove near the capital as a site for a monastery. Also at Rajagriha lived the agnostic Sanjaya, who also had many disciples under 2 named Shariputra and Magdalyayana, who were seeking enlightenment and a better teacher. Shariputra observed Asaji, one of the first 5 mendicants in the community, begging, and learned of the Buddha's teachings. He told Magdalyayana, and they told the 250 disciples of Sanjaya. Even though Sanjaya tried 3 times to stop them from going away, they all went to find the Buddha, who greeted them with the revelation that these 2 would become his greatest disciples. Within 2 weeks of joining the community, both Shariputra and Madhgalyayana had become enlightened. In meditating, Madhgalyayana had trouble with drowsiness and falling asleep. The Buddha suggested several remedies, including laying down for a while to sleep before resuming meditation. The uncle of Shariputra was a skeptic, like Sanjaya, and told the Buddha that he could not accept any conclusive doctrine. Shakyamuni simply asked him if he recognized his own doctrine as conclusive. Caught in self-contradiction, he realized the weakness and limitation of skeptical philosophy. Then the Buddha explained the law of causation in human life. Having heard that his son had become a Buddha, King Suddhodana sent Udayan to invite Shakyamuni to the capital at Kapilavastu. Udayan was converted to the new religion, and Shakyamuni returned to his hometown. His father criticized him for begging for food when he was rich enough to feed thousands of followers. Shakyamuni replied that mendicancy was the correct custom for his line, by which he meant the line of Buddhas. Verbal discussions were not enough to win over people who had known him as a boy, so the Buddha used his mystic powers to convince them. Siddhartha's half-brother Nanda was about to be declared crown prince and married to Sundari, the most beautiful woman in the kingdom. But he decided to join the community instead. However, he could not help thinking about Sundari. So the Buddha gave him a vision of hundreds of heavenly maidens, though this was later criticized by others as a wrong motivation for seeking enlightenment. Eventually, Nanda repented of this motivation and asked the Buddha to dissolve his promise of these maidens, and Nanda attained enlightenment and became an arhat, a term meaning worthy or honorable, used for disciples who attained the highest level of awareness. Siddhartha's son, Rahula, was also admitted to the community at the age of 10. But later a rule was made that minors under 20 could not join the community without permission from their parents. Many Shakya nobles also joined the community at this time, according to legend, 80,000, including Ananda, Anuruddha, Devadatta, Bhaddiya, and Kimbila. On the way to Buddha, they were accompanied by their barber and slave, Upali. They sent him back to Kapilavastu with their jewels, but afraid of the Shakya's reaction, he put them on a tree and rejoined the 5 aristocrats. Upali, who was of the lowest caste, was ordained first, giving him seniority over the nobles he had served, so that their Shakya pride might be moderated. Like Mahavira, the Buddha taught in the ordinary language of the people rather than in the aristocratic Sanskrit. Complaints that monks wandering around during the rainy season trampled the grass and destroyed living creatures led the Buddha to adopt the custom of staying in retreat during the 3 months of rain. After one of these retreats, a wealthy householder from Shravasti, who became known as Anathapindada, which means giver of alms to the unprotected, confessed to the Buddha that he enjoyed his investing and business cares. Shakyamuni suggested that he be a lay disciple and continue his work and use it as a blessing for other people. So Anathapindada invited the Buddha to spend the next rainy season at Shravasti, the chief city in Kosala, where he purchased and built the Jetavana monastery. Later, when Anathapindada was dying of a painful illness, Shariputra went and taught him the mental concentration for the avoidance of pain, usually only taught to monks. And Anathapindada died in peace. The Buddha liked the Jetavana monastery to be quiet, for he once dismissed Yashoja and 500 monks for talking too loudly after they arrived. However, they went to another place near Vaishali and made great spiritual gains. Later, when the Buddha traveled to Vaishali, he noticed that the area was illuminated. He told Ananda to invite Yashoji and the 500 monks to the hall with the peaked roof. When they arrived, the Buddha was sitting in silent meditation, and they too joined in silent meditation. Every few hours, Ananda approached the Buddha to ask him to greet these monks, but Shakyamuni remained silent, and in the morning told Ananda that if he understood meditation better, he would not have kept asking him to greet the monks, who were likewise sitting in immovable concentration. A new monk once confessed to the Buddha for having eaten meat in his alms bowl, but the Buddha forgave those who ate meat that was not prepared for them. Their ethical principle was not to harm any living creature. Nevertheless, he criticized those who hunt and kill animals for sport and warned his followers not to accept any food from such blood-stained hands. After Shakyamuni's father died as a lay disciple, he declared that a lay disciple whose mind is free from the poisons of lust, attachment, false views, and ignorance is no different than anyone else who is free. Fearing a famine, the Shakya warrior chiefs agitated for a war with Kolyas over water rights to the Rohini River. The Kolyas had built a dike to conserve water. When they refused the Shakya's demand to dismantle it, both sides prepared for war. Just before the battle was to begin, the Buddha spoke to both sides, asking them to compare the value of earth and water to the intrinsic value of people and the human blood they were about to spill. He told a parable about a decrepit demon who fed on anger and took over a royal throne, becoming stronger as more anger was directed at him, until the true king came and calmly offered to serve the throne, which led to the diminishment and disappearance of the anger demon. In this way, the war was avoided. Krisha Gautami was stricken with grief when her only son died. Unable to find a physician who could bring him back to life, someone suggested that she go to the Buddha. He told her to get a handful of mustard seed in a city, but it must be from a house where no one has ever lost a child, spouse, parent, or friend. Well, eventually she came to realize how common death was and put aside her selfish attachment to her child. Prajapati, the aunt and foster mother of Shakyamuni, asked to be admitted to the community. With Ananda acting as intermediary, the Buddha established 8 conditions for the admittance of nuns into the community. Nuns had to make obeisance to all the monks, even the newest, and nuns were not allowed to criticize a monk, though monks criticized nuns. Although they were not treated equally, at least women were allowed to join the community. The sexism was also apparent, though, when the Buddha told Ananda that the religious life would only last 500 years now instead of 1,000 because women had been admitted. A legend tells how a disciple used magical power to get a sandalwood bowl that had been tied from the top of a bamboo pole as a kind of contest. When the Buddha heard of it, he forbade those in the community to use such magical powers and had the bowl broken up and used as perfume. He suggested that his disciples only gain adherence by the miracle of instruction. In the 9th year after the Enlightenment, the Buddha was at Kaushambi, and the monk Malunkyaputta complained that the Buddha never explained whether the world is eternal or temporary, finite or infinite, whether life and the body are the same or different, or whether arhats are beyond death or not. He even threatened to leave the community if the Buddha would not answer his questions. First, the Buddha asked him if he had ever promised to explain these things. He had not. Then he told the parable of a man who was pierced by a poisoned arrow, and his relatives summoned a doctor. Suppose, he said, the physician had said that he would not remove the arrow nor treat the patient until his questions had been answered, such as who made the bow, what kind it was, all about the arrow, and so on. The man would die, and still the information would not be known. Then the Buddha told Malunkyaputta that a person would come to the end of one's life before those metaphysical questions he had asked could be answered by the Tathagata. Those questions do not tend toward edification, nor lead to supreme wisdom. However, the Buddha's teaching regarding suffering, its cause, and the means of ending it is like removing the poisoned arrow. A conflict arose in the community when a monk who refused to admit he had committed an offense was expelled. Some complained that this violated their principle that only evil deeds committed with conscious intent are morally reprehensible. However, the Buddha declared that the 2 greatest ways to obtain demerit are not to ask forgiveness after committing a wrong, and not to forgive one who has confessed and asked for forgiveness. A Kalama nobleman from north of Kaushambi admitted that he had doubts because various teachers expressed contradictory views. The Buddha responded that he was wise not to believe everything, but to question with reason and by experience. After thorough investigation whether the teachings are good, free from faults, praised by the noble, and when practiced lead to the welfare and happiness of oneself and other beings as well, then they may be accepted and lived. At Asyapura, they found Brahmin priests sacrificing horses, sheep, goats, cows, and other animals on bloody altars decorated with images of gods. The Buddha told his followers not to be deceived, but to purify their hearts and cease to kill. They should not refuse to admit they are ascetics who enjoy robes, bowl, bed, and medicine. In their simplified lives, they learn how to calm their bodies and concentrate their minds to awaken the four religious qualities of loving friendship, compassion, altruistic joy, and equanimity. The Buddha also declared that in regard to this ascetic life, all the castes are equal. A monk named Sona in the Sitavana monastery at Rajagriha was so zealous in walking that his feet left a bloody trail. The Buddha asked him if his lute could be played well if the strings were too tight or too loose. Just so, excessive zeal may make the mind weary and one's thoughts irritable and uncertain. He suggested to Sona that gradual progress led to self-mastery and happiness rather than anxiety. A young Brahmin named Vakula was so infatuated with the Buddha that he continually kept him in his sight. The Buddha explained that the one who sees the Dharma, the doctrine, sees the Buddha, but Vakula still always remained in his presence. Finally, at the end of the rainy season, the Buddha asked him to go away. Realizing that Vakula was climbing Vulture Peak to commit suicide, Shakyamuni went after him and called him back, lest he destroy the conditions for winning great fruit. An ambitious disciple named Purna decided to spread the doctrine to the Shrunaparantakas. The Buddha, knowing that they were a dangerous people, asked him what he would do if they insulted and abused him. Purna said that he would consider them good and kind for not hitting him and throwing rocks at him. But what if they hit and throw rocks? Then he would be glad they did not use clubs and swords. If they used clubs and swords, he would be glad they did not kill him. Even if they kill him, they will have delivered him from his vile body. So equipped with patience and love, Purna went to the Shrunaparantakas and was about to be killed by a hunting archer for fun, when the hunter was so struck by how willing this person was to die that he stopped and eventually accepted the three refuges of the Buddha, the doctrine, and the community. Another monastery at Purvarama near Rajagriha was donated by Vishaka, the daughter of a rich man. Once at this monastery, the Buddha remained silent on the moon day when the preaching service and confessions by the monks took place. Finally, the Buddha said to Ananda that the assembly was not wholly pure. Madhyayana, perceiving who the immoral person was, asked him to leave. When he refused to leave 3 times, he was escorted out of the hall by the arm. The Tathagata thought it strange that he should wait until he was thrown out. Then the Buddha declared that he would no longer attend these sessions, but the monks would recite the regulations themselves. When Shakyamuni was about 55, his personal attendant at the time, Nagasamala, insisted on taking a different road than the Buddha advised and was beaten by robbers. At the Shravasti monastery, the Buddha announced that he wanted to have a permanent attendant. Shariputra volunteered, but the Buddha said his work was teaching. Madhyayana and others were also rejected. Ananda remained silent, but Shakyamuni asked him if he would find it a bother. Ananda said that it would not be bothersome, but he did not consider himself worthy. Then he offered to do it on the following 8 conditions: that he not have to accept gifts or alms given to the Buddha, nor dwell in his chamber, nor accept invitations offered only to him, and that he may accompany the Perfect One when the monks are invited, that he may present him to those who come from a distance, that he may have access to him at all times, and that whatever teaching he missed by absence should be repeated to him by the Perfect One's own lips. The Buddha heartily agreed, and Ananda was his personal attendant for the rest of his life. Shakyamuni was able to tame a dangerous robber and admitted him into the community. He also bathed and treated a monk who was suffering from dysentery and had been neglected by the other monks because he lay in his own excrements. On another occasion, he found that a leper understood the doctrine very well, as he explained that whatever has a beginning must have an end. About 491 BC, when Shakyamuni was 72, a schism arose in the community because Devadatta, his cousin, wanted to take over as head of the community. But Buddha refused, saying that he would not even turn it over to Shariputra or Madhyayana, much less to a vile one to be vomited like spit. Devadatta became resentful and used his magical powers to win the favor of Prince Ajatasattu, the son of King Shrenika Bimbisara. They plotted together to take over the kingdom of Magadha and the Buddhist community. Bimbisara and the Buddha were to be murdered. But since Bimbisara turned over his kingdom to his son, he was merely put in prison where he soon died, though chronicles stated that he was killed by his son. Hired killers that they sent were converted by the Buddha, but Devadatta tried to roll a huge boulder from Vulture Peak down upon the Buddha. However, only Shakyamuni's foot was scratched. Yet, spilling the blood of a Tathagata with murderous intent created terrible karma for Devadatta. When he had learned of his intent, the Buddha had already declared that Devadatta's words and actions were not to be considered as representing the community in any way. Although he had gained a few followers, these were persuaded to return to the real community after long sermons by Shariputra and Madhyayana when Devadatta fell asleep after his own talk. Abandoned and with his psychic powers destroyed by his evil intentions, Devadatta soon became ill and died. King Ajatasattu, who had also listened to Mahavira, was eventually converted by the Buddha. But his previous evil intentions and actions prevented him from attaining the enlightenment he might have achieved in that life. Ajatasattu married the daughter of the Kosala king Pasenadi, and Pasenadi's son married a maiden of the resentful Shakyas who was secretly of low birth. Her son, Vidudaba, swore revenge against the Shakyas. Pasenadi killed his powerful general and his sons, replacing them with the nephew Diga Karayana. While Pasenadi was listening to the Buddha, Diga hurried off and put Vidudaba on the throne. Pasenadi tried to get help from Ajatasattu, but died of exposure on the way to Rajagriha. Surveying the world, the Buddha became aware of Vidudaba's intention to attack the Shakyas, and 3 times was able to convince him to turn back. But on the 4th time, the Shakyas' karma for poisoning the river could not be averted, and they were massacred. Enough Shakyas remained, however, to accept a portion of Shakyamuni's relics after his death. When Shakyamuni was 79, both his disciples, Shariputra and Madhyayana, died. Shariputra died in the home where he was born, but Madhyayana was killed by robbers to balance karma from a former life. At the age of 80, the vitality of the Tathagata's body seemed to diminish, and he declared that he only had 3 months to live. Ananda missed the opportunity to plead with him to stay until the end of the eon, as Buddhas could do, and Ananda was later blamed for that by the community. Finally, Shakyamuni took his last meal, ordering a smith named Kunda to give him some mushrooms, literally pig's food or pork, and give the monks other food, and then bury the rest of the mushrooms. Sharp sickness arose with the flow of blood and deadly pains, but the Buddha mindfully controlled them and declared that he would die in the 3rd watch of the night. He sent word that Kunda was not to feel remorse, but consider this giving of alms of the greatest merit. Ananda asked the Buddha how he was to act toward women. The Buddha advised him not to see them, but if he saw them, not to speak to them, but if speaking, to exercise mindfulness. Then he said his burial was to be handled by the local Kshatriyas. That evening, Ananda brought the local families to say goodbye, and then the Buddha answered the questions of an ascetic named Subhada. Before going through the 4 stages of higher awareness into nirvana, the last words of the Buddha were, Decay is inherent in all component things. Work out your salvation with diligence. Doctrine, or Dharma. Having taught for 45 years from his enlightenment to his death, the Buddha left behind a large compendium of teachings that were memorized by various of his disciples. Since writing was a rarity then in India, they were passed on through the community until they were written down several centuries later. These earliest texts are in the common Pali language, and usually are dialogues between the Buddha and others. Often the Buddha emphasized that it was more important for disciples to see the Dharma, the doctrine, than the Buddha, because the Dharma would remain and was what they needed to practice to attain enlightenment, and even afterward. The third refuge for the Buddhist was in the community, Sangha, of monks and nuns. The Buddha advised his followers not to feel ill will or get angry when others spoke against them, because this might disrupt their self-mastery and prevent them from being able to judge whether the criticism was valid or not. For the same reason, they should not be overly glad when the doctrine is praised. In regard to the moral precepts, the Buddha describes himself as having put away the killing of living things, holding himself aloof from the destruction of life. Having laid aside weapons, he is ashamed of roughness and full of mercy, being compassionate and kind to all creatures. He does not take what has not been given, is chaste, and speaks truth, being faithful and trustworthy, not breaking his word to the world. He has put away lying and slander and does not raise quarrels. Thus does he live, as a binder together of those who are divided, an encourager of those who are friends, a peacemaker, a lover of peace, impassioned for peace, a speaker of words that make for peace. In describing the fruits of living as a recluse, the Buddha emphasizes to King Ajatasattu the importance of mindfulness toward the ethical significance of every action and word. Then, having mastered the moral precepts, restrained the senses, endowed with mindfulness and self-possession, filled with content, the recluse chooses a lonely and quiet spot to meditate in order to purify the mind of lusts, the wish to injure, ill temper, sloth, worry, irritability, wavering, and doubt. At the end of this long dialogue, King Ajatasattu confesses his sin in putting to death his father and asks to be a disciple of the Blessed One. The Buddha accepted his confession and noted that in the tradition of the noble one's discipline, whoever sees one's fault as a fault and correctly confesses it shall attain self-restraint in the future. The Buddha was quite a penetrating psychologist and described the psychological causality that leads to suffering in his theory of pratitya samutpada, dependent origination. Sorrow, lamentation, misery, grief, despair, old age, and death are all caused by birth, which depends on existence, which depends on attachment, which depends on desire, which depends on sensation, which depends on contact, which depends on the six senses, which depends on name and form, which depends on consciousness, which depends on karma, which depends on ignorance. However, by ending ignorance, then karma, consciousness, name and form, the six senses, contact, sensation, desire, attachment, existence, and birth, with all the misery that comes after birth, can be ended. Sensation and desire also lead to pursuit, decision, gain, passion, tenacity, possession, avarice, and guarding possessions, which can lead to blows and wounds, strife, quarreling, slander, and lies. This process is further described in a parable about an ancient kingdom where the celestial wheel symbolizing the Dharma disappeared. The king ignored the advice of the sages that he should share some of his wealth with the destitute. This led to widespread poverty and theft. At first, the king gave some wealth to a thief to solve his problem, but then, not wanting to reward stealing, he ordered that thieves have their heads cut off. This led to the arming of the poor, increased violence associated with their stealing, and more murders. This also caused more lying, evil speaking, and false opinions. Eventually, greed, adultery, perverted lust, and incest became common, followed by lack of respect for parents, religious teachers, and the heads of the clans. Human life became like hunters feel toward their game, and at times people treated each other like wild beasts. Finally, deciding to do something good, people started to abstain from taking life, which led to abstaining from taking what is not given, abstaining from lying, and abstaining from adultery. As the virtues were practiced, the health of the society returned. When this happens, a fully awakened one, a Buddha called Maitreya, will come. Until then, the Buddha recommends that people live as islands unto themselves, taking the Dharma as their refuge, letting the mind be filled with love, compassion, joy, and equanimity. In another dialogue, the Buddha clarifies the meaning of the Eightfold Path by saying that right view is the knowledge of the Four Noble Truths of suffering, its cause, cessation, and the way that leads to its cessation. Right aspiration is towards benevolence and kindness. Right speech is to abstain from lying, slander, abuse, and idle talk. Right doing is to abstain from taking life, from taking what is not given, and from carnal indulgence. Right livelihood is only described as putting away wrong livelihood. Right effort is towards preventing bad states from arising, putting away evil that has arisen, toward good states arising, and nurturing good that does arise. Right mindfulness is being self-possessed and mindful in regard to the body, overcoming craving and dejection in feelings, thoughts, and ideas. Right rapture is being aloof from sensuous appetites and evil ideas, entering into and abiding in the four levels of higher awareness. The first of these has cogitation and deliberation born of solitude and is full of ease and joy. The second suppresses cogitation and deliberation, evoking by itself concentration, calming the mind and dwelling on high. In the third stage, one is disenchanted with joy, is calmly contemplative and aware. The fourth state leaves behind ease and transcends former happiness and melancholy by entering into the rapture of pure mindfulness and equanimity, feeling neither ease nor ill. According to the Buddha, the four motives that lead to evil deeds are partiality, enmity, stupidity, and fear. The 6 channels for dissipating wealth are being addicted to liquors, frequenting the streets at unseemly hours, haunting fairs, gambling, bad companions, and idleness. These ethical teachings and discourses on many other subjects are from the sayings Nikaya of the Buddha in the first of the 3 baskets, Tripitaka, that make up the Pali Canon. The second basket contains the discipline, Vinaya books, for the monks and nuns. Later commentaries on the original teachings make up the third basket of higher doctrines, Abhidharma. The first book in this last collection has been called a Manual of Psychological Ethics, Dhamma Sangani. The Dhamma Sangani lists the good states of consciousness as the following: contact, feeling, perception, volition, thought, application, sustained thinking, zest, ease, self-collectedness, the faculties of faith, energy, mindfulness, concentration, insight, ideation, gladness, and life. Right views, endeavor, mindfulness, and concentration. The powers of faith, energy, mindfulness, concentration, insight, conscientiousness, and the fear of blame. The absence of greed, hate, dullness, covetousness, and malice. Serenity, lightness, plasticity, facility, fitness, and directness in mind and mental factors. Intelligence, quiet, intuition, grasp, and balance. The list of bad states of consciousness is similar, except that the views, intention, endeavor, and concentration are wrong instead of right, and there is unconscientiousness, disregard of blame, lust, dullness, and covetousness instead of their absence. In a further discussion of these ties, the perversion of rules and rituals, and the disposition to dogmatize are added to covetousness, lust, and ill will. To the cankers, asavas, of sensuality, rebirth, and ignorance is added speculative opinion about useless metaphysical questions, such as whether the world is eternal, the soul is infinite, the soul and body are different, or whether one exists after death. A work on human types, Pugala Panati, analyzes individuals in terms of many characteristics, such as the six sense organs and their objects, including mind as the sixth sense, 18 elements of cognition, 22 faculties or functions, and such negative traits as being wrathful, vengeful, a hypocrite, a charlatan, jealous, avaricious, shameless, impudent, disobedient, associating with the wicked, having unguarded senses, being immoderate as to food, forgetful, unmindful, infringing moral laws, having wrong views, internal and external fetters as well as their opposites. However, these texts mostly consist of dry and abstract lists with many repetitions. So if you want to go over there, maybe we'll have some questions and discussion.
Was it Nanda, Siddhartha's brother then?
No, but he was his favorite disciple.
I kind of thought you said
Nanda. His brother's name was Nanda, I think.
Oh, Nanda.
Yeah.
Oh.
So it sounds similar, but it's a different person. Ananda was the one who became his attendant for the last 25 years of his life. But his brother's name was Nanda. It starts with an N.
When the Buddha said that they couldn't eat flesh killed from sport.
They shouldn't accept food, or actually, from someone who has essentially blood on their hands from being a hunter.
Okay.
But if they are begging and someone accidentally puts meat in their bowl that wasn't prepared for them and they didn't know it was there, then they're not necessarily guilty for that. Because they're not telling them to create meat for them, make meat for them, so that if this person had gotten the meat accidentally in their bowl, and so it wasn't not intentional.
And what's the story on women with the Buddha? How can we understand the non-equality and the kind of the degrading attitude that he had?
Well, it's all relative. I mean, from the perspective of our time with feminism, where we're really working for complete equality between the sexes, we have a very high standard. But all of human history of civilization is extremely patriarchal, and India is no exception. And so for the Buddha and Mahavira to even admit women into their order was totally revolutionary. Because in the Hinduism, in the Brahmins, the women could never be priests. They could never be in the religious order. They were very much second class. Now, when Buddha admitted them into order, he couldn't quite go that far that they could be totally equal with the men. It was just too far beyond them, I guess, their mindset. And so the women did have to take criticism, from the monks and not give it. And that's just the basic patriarchal fact of what we have to realize. But I think it's interesting to note that and to see that as a criticism from a universal ethical principle, that's obviously sexism. Yeah.
When you were discussing the austerities of Buddha,
right,
it really affected me, and I was considering how do we, living in this present age, get beyond the flesh and materialistic attitudes that we all are forced to be a part of every day, almost all day, constantly.
Well, the wonderful thing I like about the Buddha is what he calls the middle path, and that is that, there's these two extremes. You can live a life of luxury and get totally wrapped up in materialism, which he had everything. He was a prince, he had servants and anything he wanted, in the finest clothes and everything. He could have all the luxuries. He didn't have the technology like we have, but he had all the luxuries he could want. And that extreme life didn't work, and he went to the opposite extreme, which is sort of what Mahavira did, but Mahavira that became sort of their way. But he found that didn't work, because fasting, he lost his energy, and it was too painful, and it's like, and the thing about, well, you being super ascetic in order to like win a reward in heaven. Well, that's the same kind of thing. I mean, and that kind of comes up in Jainism. They have these visions of jewels and riches like after you die. You know, it's like, well, what's the difference? Why not have it here? It's the same. Yeah, it's the same kind of trap, you know. And so what he found was neither extreme worked. The moderate middle, and the Greeks were very much into this too, not anything to any excess. And so, but they had a very simplified life. The monks especially, they would just go out with their bowls maybe twice a day and for food, and they would, you know, maybe occasionally do a little work, but primarily just meditate or have discussions and so on. And so but even in our modern complex society, it seems to me that it's possible in a relative sense to simplify our lives. I mean, you know, here in the United States, like people think, a lot of people think if you don't have $20 or $30 or $40,000 a year, you know, you're deprived, you know. And yet it's possible to live much more simply, so you don't have to, you know, expend all your energy, you know, making money, so you can have all these things that you don't really need necessarily. So it seems to me that there is a middle path, and you don't have to torture yourself. You know, you don't have to starve yourself and, you know, become as skinny as a rail, but you don't have to overeat either, you know. And you know, if you buy healthy food, it doesn't cost that much. If you live simply, you know. So there's a moderate way, there's a middle path, I think, that that can work quite well. It's not that glamorous in that way, you know, because it just seems like you're just a normal person in some ways, you know. But I think it can give you more time. Like Thoreau said, he'd rather have free time than, you know, so that he could study himself and life and so on.
Yeah, I know that a lot of people have the desire at this point in life, and I see a lot of unhappiness. A lot of people are seeking this, what you used, your term was supreme peace. And, I just wondered if, I would assume that what your explanation would kind of bring us to that supreme peace where we backed away from all of the things that we want.
And meditation is really the key here, I think, because if you're spending all your time working and playing, and, you know, and not having any time to know yourself and to let your mind unravel and look at your life and be at peace and search within yourself, that time, there's just no getting around it. You know, of course, there's quality with it and so on. It really helps, and that's, you know, where a lot of times, you know, people just don't take the time in our busy life that has so many distractions too. I mean, there's so many exciting things that we can do now, you know, with all the wealth and technology we have and everything. But it takes a certain amount of self-discipline to you know, put that aside at times and to sit in meditation.